I've worn this badge for 9 years, and truth be told, some mornings it still feels heavier than iron. Folks see it pinned neat on my chest and think it's a mark of order, a thing that makes a man proud, but I know better. To me, it's always been a reminder that peace doesn't hold itself together. Someone has to keep watch, even in a place as quiet as Willow Run. And quiet it is most days. The sun rises over the ridge, the dust curls in little circles down the street, and life moves at the slow pace of a mule. That's the way I like it. Nothing too loud, nothing too fast. Just enough noise to remind me I'm still breathing, but never so much I can't hear myself think. I wasn't born for this, though. Before Willow Run, I was a soldier. 10 years in the field, wearing blue, carrying a rifle, burying men I knew better than brothers. I don't say much about that time. Some things aren't meant for sharing, and the ones who were there don't need my words to remember. I still see them at night, though. Their faces, the way the air shook when the cannons opened, the smell of wet earth and powder that never washed off. You don't outlive that, you carry it. And after the war, I came west to find a place where maybe I could carry it a little quieter. Willow Run was too small to be of much interest to anyone. No gold, no rail line, just hard ground and harder living. When I stepped off the wagon all those years ago, there was a saloon with a broken sign, a grain store leaning to one side, and a handful of porches with paint long gone to the wind. I looked around and thought, this is it. A place where trouble would pass us by because there was nothing here worth taking. A place a man could keep order without raising his voice because there weren't enough people to fight it. And for the better part of a decade, that's exactly what it's been. My days are simple. I rise before the sun, put on the pot, sip bitter coffee that never quite tastes right, and sit on the steps of the office chewing jerky like it's supper. I watch the town wake, watch Doyle limp across the road to tend his feed sacks, watch Mrs. Beckett sweep her porch like she's beating back sin itself. I nod, they nod back, and the day goes on. That's all I need. No fuss, no excitement. Just routine. Routine has been the one thing holding me steady since I laid down my rifle. But the truth is, routine is also a way of hiding. I never married after Caroline. She was gone before I could put my arms around her again. Typhoid took her while I was still wearing blue, and by the time I came back, there was no home waiting. Just silence and empty rooms. You don't recover from that. You just learn to keep moving. Sheriff seemed as good a way as any. A man with no family is a man with no weak point, and maybe I told myself that was strength. But deep down, I knew it was only another kind of loneliness, dressed up as duty. Evenings are the worst. I sit on the porch, listening to the wind rattle the store signs, the far-off creak of a pump, the tinny sound of a piano through the saloon's open door. I tell myself, I like the stillness, but there are nights when the silence presses too hard. Nights when I remember laughter that's not there anymore. Nights when I wish someone would walk through the door and ask me something ordinary, just so I'd hear another voice that wasn't my own. I suppose that's why I stay so steady. If I let myself unravel even a little, there'd be nothing to hold me upright. The men who came west after the war, a lot of them drank themselves hollow or gambled away what little they had. I didn't want that, so I chose quiet. Chose to be the man folks didn't bother because he looked like stone. It worked, until the day she walked into town, but I'll get to that. For now, I want you to understand who I was before, just a man sitting in the heat, boots planted, badge pinned, heart locked up tight, waiting out the years like he was waiting out a storm. That's all I was. And maybe that's why her shadow stretched so far across my steps when she appeared, because I'd forgotten what it felt like for something to break the stillness. If you've made it this far listening to me, I'd ask you to stay with me a little longer. There's more to tell, and it's not just my story anymore. It's hers too, and the boys', and the way we came to stitch together something neither of us thought we had left in us. So if this story means something to you, if you've ever known what it is to sit alone and wonder if life will ever give you more than silence, then don't just leave it here. Like the video, leave me a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the truth is, this isn't a tale of a sheriff keeping order in a quiet town. It's about what happens when desperation meets duty and how sometimes, against all odds, it makes a man feel alive again. The afternoon had been so still, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I remember sitting there on the steps of the office with the sun bleeding low over the ridge, chewing on a strip of jerky, not thinking much of anything. The streets were empty except for Doyle's dog asleep in the dust, and a couple of horses with their heads hung low outside the store. Just another slow day in Willow Run, the kind I had grown used to. But then I saw her. At first I thought the heat was playing tricks with my eyes, the kind of shimmer that makes a road look like water. She came walking out of that haze, slow, steady, like she'd been at it for hours. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, thin as a fence rail, wearing a blue dress torn near the hem. She had no shoes, and I could see the raw red marks on her feet even from where I sat. Her shoulders were burned from the sun, one strap fallen loose, her skin coated in dust and sweat, and in her arms, pressed close, against her, was a boy no more than 3. He wasn't crying, and that was the first thing that caught me. Children that small usually wail when they're tired or hungry, but this one was too far past that. His little arms clung around her neck like they were the only strength she had left. His legs dangled limp, his face buried in her shoulder. She wasn't carrying him like a burden, though. She carried him like he was the only reason she hadn't fallen into the dirt. There was no call for help, no looking around, just a straight walk up the center of the street, her shadow stretched long in front of her. Folks moved curtains aside to watch, a few faces pressing to the saloon window, but not a soul stepped out. I reckon they were waiting to see what I'd do, because that's the way of it in towns like this. A stranger walks in, it's the sheriff's problem. I stood up, slow and deliberate. My hand brushed the edge of my belt out of habit, not because I thought she was danger, but because the years had taught me never to be unready. She came on until she reached the bottom of my steps, then stopped. When she lifted her head, I saw her eyes, bloodshot, rimmed with red, and so dry it looked like every tear had been spent long before she reached me. Dirt streaked her face, her lips cracked and split. She looked at me the way a drowning person looks at a shore. Not sure if they can make it, not sure if it will hold them. And then she spoke. "Take me as your concubine," she said, her voice flat and worn out. "I can do whatever you want. Just feed my boy." The words landed heavy, heavier than any threat I'd ever faced. She didn't say it like a plea, not like a woman bargaining for mercy. There was no shame in it, no theater. It was empty, raw survival. The kind of thing said when every other choice has been stripped away. She wasn't bluffing. I could see it in the way her arms trembled, in the way she kept her balance only by shifting the boy higher against her hip. That wasn't an offer, it was surrender. She had given up everything except the one thing that mattered. That child. I felt my jaw tighten. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I'd seen desperation in battlefields, seen men barter away their souls for a drink of water or one more breath, but this was different. This was a woman walking into a strange town, ready to give herself to a stranger because she believed that was the only way her son would see tomorrow. Something behind my ribs shifted, a tightness I hadn't felt in years. I didn't reach for her, didn't tell her no or yes. Instead, I stepped aside and pulled the office door open. I didn't say a word, just held it there. She hesitated, and in that flicker I saw fear, like she thought maybe it was a trick. Maybe I'd shut it in her face, but then she moved, slow and careful, into the cooler air inside. The office was plain. Desk, 2 chairs, a rifle on the wall, maps rolled in the bent corner. I went to the shelf and took down what I had, a hunk of cornbread from that morning, dry but still edible, and a jug of milk cool enough to drink. I set them on the desk and nodded to the bench. She sat, legs trembling, and adjusted the boy into her lap. She whispered something in his ear, and he stirred, blinking up at the bread like it was the first food he'd seen in days. His little hands shook as he reached for it, stuffing pieces into his mouth between slow sips of milk. He ate like he thought it might vanish if he stopped. I watched, not with pity, not with judgment, just watching. The woman didn't touch the food. She sat with her hands clenched tight, eyes fixed on the floorboards. She had brought him here to survive, and that was enough. I realized then she hadn't come for herself at all. She would have gone without, gone to ground, even died out on the ridge if not for that boy. Something inside me turned hard as stone. I didn't owe her anything, and she hadn't asked for kindness, but there was no way in hell I was letting her walk back into that heat with nothing. Not her, not the boy. That was the moment everything shifted, though I didn't know it yet. One woman, one child, stepping into my quiet life like a storm front rolling over the desert. I didn't know her name then, didn't know her past, didn't know the danger trailing behind her. All I knew was this. They weren't going anywhere that night, and no one was going to take them out of Willow Run without going through me first. I can still hear her voice the way it cracked through the heat that day, dry as dust and stripped of anything soft. Take me as your concubine. I can do whatever you want. Just feed my boy. Those words weren't spoken like a bargain. They were laid down flat, like someone dropping the last coin they had onto a table, knowing it wouldn't be enough, but having nothing else left to offer. I've been around long enough to tell when a person is bluffing, when they're playing angles, when they're trying to twist pity into profit. But she wasn't doing any of that. There was nothing in her tone but surrender. She wasn't offering herself to me. She was giving herself up to survive. And God help me, it hit harder than any bullet I'd ever taken. I didn't say a word. My throat had gone tight, and there's no point in speaking when you don't know if you can keep your voice steady. I just opened the door to my office and stepped aside. I thought maybe she'd refuse, maybe she'd turn away out of pride or fear, but she didn't. She hesitated. Sure, her shoulders stiffened like she was waiting for me to shove her back into the dust, but when that didn't come, she shifted her boy higher on her hip and walked past me. I felt her brush the air as she went, and I swear the whole place seemed smaller with her inside it. The room was plain as always. A desk scarred from years of elbows and spilled ink, a chair with one leg that creaked, a shelf with rations and odds and ends. I'd never seen it as anything but a place to work, but with her there, it felt suddenly like I was showing a stranger the inside of my skin. I went to the shelf and pulled what I had, a piece of cornbread left over from that morning, and the jug of milk I kept shaded. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. I set them on the desk and nodded toward the bench. She didn't ask questions. She lowered herself slow, the boy sagging against her lap, his head lolling until she whispered something in his ear. That little one stirred, rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, and when he saw the bread, his whole body changed. He reached for it with small, trembling fingers and shoved a piece into his mouth. He didn't chew fast, not like children usually do. He chewed careful, pausing every so often to sip at the milk, like he was afraid the food might vanish before he finished it. I've seen men on the line eat like that, after days with no rations, hoarding each bite in their cheeks as if holding proof the world hadn't forgotten them. That boy was no different, except he was too small to know what it meant to fear tomorrow. The woman didn't touch a crumb. Her hands sat clenched in her lap, knuckles white, fingers twisting against each other. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor. I watched her from the doorway, the way her shoulders hunched slightly forward, not in defeat but in defense, as if bracing for me to demand my part of the bargain she'd offered outside. My gut twisted at the thought. I knew then I couldn't let her believe that's what she'd come to. But I didn't speak yet. I've learned silence can be kinder than words, at least until you know what words are worth saying. I let the boy eat, let the sound of his small breaths and the scrape of his teeth on bread fill the room. Every now and then, he'd glance up at me, wide-eyed, wary, then back to his meal. And I realized something I hadn't felt in years. I was being watched not as sheriff, not as a man with a badge or a gun, but as someone who might decide whether that child lived another day. That weight sat heavier than the badge ever did. When the boy finished, crumbs dusting his shirt, I went to the shelf again and pulled down a blanket. I gestured toward the back room. I still hadn't spoken. I didn't need to. She stood, slow and uncertain, like a deer waiting for the crack of a rifle. Her bare feet left faint smudges of dried blood on my floorboards as she walked. She carried the boy to the cot, tucked him under the blanket with a care so deliberate it stopped me cold. She moved as though the act of tucking him in was the one thing keeping her stitched together. Then she sat on the edge of the cot, facing away from me, her shoulders low but not collapsed. I left her there, went back to the porch, sat down in the fading light with my jerky untouched in my hand. I tried to steady my breathing, but inside was rattled. I thought I'd chosen this town for its quiet, for the safety of routine, but watching her walk in, watching her boy eat like it was his last meal, I knew there was no such thing as safe silence anymore. She had broken it, and instead of wanting it back, I felt something I hadn't in years, a reason to keep watch, not just because it was duty, but because someone needed me to. That night, with the stars just beginning to show over the ridge, I made a decision without saying it out loud. She wasn't going anywhere, not tonight, not until she could stand on her own 2 feet without offering herself away to survive. She hadn't asked for kindness, only food, so I gave it. And I knew, as sure as I'd ever known anything, that no one would drag her or that boy out of Willow Run without crossing me first. When the boy's little hands finally went still and his breathing slowed, I knew he'd eaten enough to keep him through the night. He lay curled on that cot in the back room, the blanket tucked around his shoulders like a second skin, one small fist still clutching at nothing. His lips moved now and then, as if he were dreaming of food, but his body had eased, his chest rising steady for the first time since I laid eyes on him. His mother sat on the edge of the cot, back straight but shoulders heavy, her hands folded in her lap as though she didn't know what to do with them anymore. I didn't ask her anything, didn't press her for where she'd come from or why she'd stumbled into town in such shape. I knew the look of someone running from something that had already taken too much. You don't need words to understand that kind of truth. I stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching her lean down and whisper something against her boy's hair. I couldn't hear the words, but I could tell they weren't for me. They were a mother's promise, quiet and fierce, the kind you make when you've already given up everything, but won't give up this. She didn't look up at me. She just smoothed the blanket, brushed the boy's cheek with the back of her hand, and kept herself steady. I nodded once, though she couldn't see it, then left her there. Back on the porch, the last of the sun was bleeding out across the ridge, and a faint breeze stirred the dust into little swirls at my boots. The town was settling down, shutters drawn, lamps lit behind curtains, a few notes of piano drifting from the saloon. I sat on the top step, elbows on my knees, jerky still clenched in my fist but forgotten. My stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from the weight of what had just walked into my life. For years, I'd told myself I liked the silence. That routine was enough. That duty was all I needed to keep from falling apart. But that woman and her boy had walked into my office with nothing but desperation. And in one breath, they'd turned my silence into something fragile. I knew I'd spend the night listening for every sound that might mean trouble, because suddenly there was something inside worth guarding. It wasn't pity. I don't carry much of that. Pity dies quick on battlefields, and once it's gone, it doesn't come back easy. No, it was something else. A kind of stubbornness. A feeling that it wasn't right for her to believe she had to offer herself just to keep her son alive. That kind of surrender wasn't going to happen under my roof. Not while I was breathing. I stayed out there until the stars came out clear and sharp, scattered like salt across the black sky. I could hear faint sounds from the back room, the shift of the cot as she moved, the soft exhale of her boy. She never cried, never made a sound. She carried herself like someone too tired to break down, like she'd already spent every tear she had long before reaching me. And maybe that's what cut deepest, because I knew the kind of strength it takes to hold yourself together when everything else has already gone to ruin. When I finally stepped back inside, the office felt different, not just because someone else was in it, but because it no longer belonged only to me. Her shoes, or what was left of them, lay near the cot. The blanket I'd given her was pulled snug around the boy. My desk sat as it always did, papers stacked, lamp low, rifle on the wall, but somehow the air carried something softer. I poured myself a cup of water, sat in my chair, and watched the lamplight flicker across the room. She didn't stir, not even when the chair creaked beneath me. Maybe she was too far gone into exhaustion, Or maybe she trusted, for that moment, that I wasn't going to take what she'd offered. Either way, she leaned her head back against the wall, eyes half closed, her hand resting on her boy's arm. I wanted to tell her she could rest, that she was safe, but I kept my mouth shut. Words are easy. Safety isn't. Better she feel it in the walls, in the roof, in the locked door, than hear it from my lips. I sat like that for hours, listening to the night. Every creak of wood, every shift of the wind, I measured against danger. When you've carried loss as long as I have, you learn to keep watch, not just for yourself, but for whoever else is too weary to do it. My rifle stayed across my knees, polished but never fired in years, and for the first time in a long while, I was glad of its weight. By the time the lamp burned down low, I leaned back and let the silence hold. She and the boy slept. The town was quiet, and for that one night, I promised myself I would stand between them and whatever shadows tried to reach across Willow Run. I didn't know her anything, but that didn't matter. She hadn't come asking for kindness, only bread and a place for her boy to rest. So I gave it. And though I didn't say it out loud, I knew the truth. From that night on, they were safe here. No one would take them out of this town without going through me first. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm I hadn't expected, not loud or obvious, but quiet. The kind of rhythm you only notice when you stop and realize the silence has changed. I rose before first light like always, brewed the same bitter coffee, sat on the porch with the cup cooling in my hand. But now, there were other sounds inside the office, small things, the soft shift of a cot, a child's sleepy cough, the faint scrape of cloth as she moved about, careful not to wake him. It wasn't much, but to a man who'd lived alone as long as I had, it felt like a whole different kind of dawn. The boy, Tommy, grew steadier by the hour. He still clung to her leg most times, peeking at me from behind her skirts with those wide eyes, but the hollowness I'd seen in him that first day started to lift. He laughed once when Doyle's old barn cat wandered by, swatting at his small hands, and the sound startled me so much I nearly dropped my cup. It wasn't loud, just a short burst, but it was alive, and I realized it had been years since laughter like that had filled my walls. I didn't say a word about it, just nodded at him when his eyes found mine, and he ducked back behind her dress with the wooden horse I'd given him clutched tight. She, Layla, never wasted a step. By the second morning, she'd found the broom leaning by the fence and set to sweeping the porch. She didn't ask permission, didn't wait for me to suggest it. She just worked, steady strokes, her hair pulled back, sleeves rolled high, while the boy sat in the shade stacking little piles of dust with a stick. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and watched. Part of me wanted to tell her she didn't owe me anything, that she didn't have to pay her way with chores, but the words stuck in my throat. Maybe she needed the work as much as I needed the quiet. Work makes a person feel anchored, and I wasn't about to take that from her. When she cooked that first supper, it was nothing fancy, just beans and a strip of salt pork I'd had in the cupboard, but she made it stretch into 2 bowls, not 3. She didn't fix a plate for herself. I split mine with Tommy, slid the rest across to him, and let her watch. She didn't argue, just kept her eyes low, her hand steady on the boy's shoulder as he ate. Later that night, after she'd settled him on the cot, she came back out to the porch and sat down a few steps away from me. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was shared, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was the only one carrying it. Inside, she kept to herself, but I started noticing the small ways she shaped the space. My floorboards got scrubbed cleaner than they'd been in years. The desk, usually scattered with wanted posters and half-empty mugs, was dusted and stacked neat. She stitched the tear in her own dress by lamplight, the thread moving through her fingers slow and precise, her head bent in concentration. And though she never said it out loud, she started carrying herself different, less like a shadow ready to vanish, and more like someone testing whether she might be allowed to stay. I tried not to stare, but I saw more than I let on. The fading bruises under her eyes, the scars along her arms, the way her gaze never lingered in one place for long. She carried her fear deep, not as a wound you could see, but as something buried in her ribs. And yet, When she stood outside, hanging a blanket to air or combing Tommy's hair with her fingers, I caught glimpses of something else. A quiet strength, the kind born from surviving too much and still finding a way to keep moving. The town noticed, of course. People in small places always do. Mrs. Beckett watched her sweep the porch and later cornered me with her folded arms and sharp tongue. "Don't look like she's got kin," she said. I didn't answer, just kept mending the hinge on the jail door until she gave up and walked away. I never cared much for the gossip, but I could feel the eyes lingering longer than before. Folks wondered what she was doing under my roof, and some of them didn't like not knowing the answer. Still, she carried herself calm, gave polite nods when spoken to, and kept her hands busy. She wasn't shrinking, and I respected that. What surprised me most was how quickly my routines bent around them without breaking. I found myself pouring an extra cup of water, setting aside the better half of the bread, cutting apples small for the boy. Not because they asked, but because it felt natural. At night, when I cleaned my revolver out of habit, I did it listening to the soft rustle of a blanket in the back room instead of the empty silence I'd known for years. And though I never said it, I slept lighter, listening for sounds beyond the usual creak of wood and stir of wind. By the third morning, she was outside at the pump before the town was fully awake, drawing water with strong, practiced pulls. Tommy sat on an overturned bucket chewing dried apple, his legs kicking at the dust, his eyes following her every move. I watched from the doorway, coffee in hand, and something settled in me I hadn't felt in a long while. A steadiness not born from routine, but from the sight of life returning, from the sound of work and breath and quiet laughter finding its way back into these walls. I didn't know how long they'd stay. I didn't know if trouble was still trailing them, waiting to ride into town. But I knew this much. For the first time since Caroline, my home didn't feel empty, and I wasn't about to let that be taken from them, or from me, without a fight. It didn't take long before the town started whispering. Willow Run was small, too small for anything to slip past the curtains without someone leaning to see. Folks can accept a lot out here if you give them time, but they don't stay quiet while they're deciding whether they approve or not. By the end of the first week, I could feel it in the air every time I walked down the street. Heads turned, conversations dipped when I passed, and eyes lingered longer than they used to. Some tried to mask it as concern, but I lived among them too long not to hear the judgment tucked beneath their words. Mrs. Beckett was the first to speak it plain. She'd been sweeping her porch like always, shoulders stiff, her broom thudding against the boards with more force than needed. I was mending the hinge on the jail cell door when she crossed the road, arms folded tight. "That woman's still in your office, Sheriff," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Don't look like she's got kin. Don't look like she belongs anywhere." I didn't even lift my head. I just kept working the hinge slow, turning the screw until the squeak gave way to silence. My silence was answer enough, and eventually she huffed and turned back toward her house, but not before I caught the way her eyes darted toward the office windows. Others weren't so direct, but their meaning was the same. At the store, one of the younger ranch hands muttered half under his breath, "Sheriff's got himself company now," loud enough that I could hear it. I looked at him steady until he dropped his eyes, muttering something else I didn't bother to catch. At the stable, Emmett Thorne brushed his mule with slow strokes and said, "Ain't proper, a stranger taking up in the jailhouse." I told him nothing at all, just checked the fence post and walked on. Words wouldn't change his thinking. Only time and the fact that I wasn't moving her out would. Even the storekeeper, a man who'd always offered me credit without hesitation, paused longer than usual before handing over my supplies. He didn't say it, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his face, the weighing of judgment against respect. That was fine. Respect held stronger in this town than gossip ever did, and I'd earned enough of it to keep her safe inside my walls. I noticed Layla catching on to it too. She never asked, but her eyes shifted when someone walked past the porch, her shoulders tensing when voices lowered nearby. She didn't shrink though. That's what struck me most. She didn't meet their stares, didn't explain herself, but she didn't cower either. She kept sweeping, kept mending, kept drawing water and brushing the mare, as if the weight of their looks was nothing new to her. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe she'd been carrying the world's judgment for years before she reached me. Still, I could see the question flicker across her face now and then. Was I going to bend to it? Was I going to send her back into the dust because the town decided she didn't belong? I never answered it with words, only with the steadiness of letting her stay, with the extra plate on the table, with the quiet nods when she took up work without being asked. Sometimes that's louder than any speech a man could give. Tommy, though, he didn't notice any of it. He was too busy playing with that wooden horse, too busy chasing Doyle's cat around the yard, too busy learning how to laugh again. Children are like that. They don't carry shame until grown folks hand it to them. He looked at me with trust, not questions, and that was enough to keep me steady when the stairs burned. One morning, I told her, "You can take the boy to church if you want. Miss Porter teaches some of the younger ones in the back room. He'll be safe there." She froze, her hand still on the rag she'd been using to scrub the table. "Will they know what I was?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, almost careful, as though even asking might bring punishment. I met her eyes and said, "You were hungry. That's all they need to know." She looked at me a long moment, not with thanks, but with the kind of searching gaze a person gives when they're trying to believe something they've never been told before. She nodded, barely, then went back to wiping the table. When Sunday came, I sat on the porch with my coffee, while she dressed the boy in the cleanest shirt they had. She combed his hair with her fingers, tied a scrap of cloth around his neck to keep the dust off, and walked him across the road with her head high, though I knew it cost her something to do it. Some nodded politely, others stared too long. One woman whispered behind her fan, but Miss Porter didn't hesitate. She took the boy's hand and guided him in with the others. I stayed where I was, watching from a distance, and I saw the way Layla's shoulders dropped just a fraction when Tommy turned back and waved at her before disappearing inside. That half-inch of relief on her face was worth more than 100 town nods. That night, after she'd settled Tommy on the cot, she came back to the porch where I sat under the stars. She didn't ask if the town would keep talking, and I didn't offer false promises. She just sat beside me, close enough for me to hear her breathing, and for the first time, I knew she was starting to believe she wasn't going to be sent away because other people said so. And sitting there, with the dust settling quiet around us, I realized something else. I didn't care what the town whispered. Let them talk. My duty wasn't to please them. My duty was to the woman who had walked into my silence ready to surrender her life for her boy, and to the boy who deserved to grow up without carrying the weight of their judgment. That was enough for me. I'd known it was only a matter of time before someone came looking. You don't see a woman walk barefoot out of the desert with a child clinging to her hip unless she's running from something mean enough to drive her past her limits. The quiet days we'd been building couldn't last untouched, not with the way she kept glancing at the horizon when she thought no one noticed. I felt it too, in the stillness of certain nights when the wind shifted and the horses pricked their ears at sounds I couldn't hear. I'd tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I was waiting. And the waiting ended the night those riders came in. I heard them before I saw them. Hooves carrying slow but heavy across the hard pack, the kind of rhythm that says, a man ain't just passing through. I stepped out onto the porch, felt the weight of the badge against my chest, and planted my boots firm. The moon was high, throwing pale light across the road, and dust rose around the three men as they came down the center of town. Willow Run had already tucked itself away. The saloon door swung in the wind, church bell rope clinked faintly overhead, but no one came out. Curtains twitched, that was all. This was mine to meet. The lead rider pulled his horse to a halt a few feet from the office. Tall, sharp jaw, a filthy kerchief at his throat, pistol hanging easy at his hip. The two behind him stayed mounted, eyes shifting left and right like they were sniffing for weakness. The leader fixed me with a hard stare. "You Mason Dyer?" he asked. I nodded once. "That's right. I heard you got a woman and a boy holed up here. Name's Layla. Been missing from her husband's property more'n a month." The words burned in my chest, but I kept my voice flat. "She's not anyone's property." He smirked, tilted his head. "That's so. Last I heard, she was bound legal to Vernon Rudd. Rudd don't take kindly to thieves. Says she ran, took the boy too, claims the boy's half his blood." Inside the doorway, I felt the shift of air. I didn't need to turn to know she was there. holding Tommy tight against her leg, her breath caught in her throat. My jaw tightened. "She's not stolen," I said. "She left." The man leaned forward on his saddle horn, his eyes narrowing. "Rudd says otherwise, and I don't much care what story you've told yourself. I'm here to collect. You hand her over, we ride out quiet." I stepped down one porch stair, boots grinding the dirt. "She ain't going anywhere with you." The two behind him shifted, hands brushing belts. The air went still, sharp as a drawn blade. I could feel her eyes on my back, her body tensed to run, though there was nowhere left to go. My pulse thudded once hard, then steadied like it always did when the world pressed too close. I didn't draw, not yet, but my hand hovered easy, practiced, ready. "You want to make this into something," I said low. "We can. Or you can ride back to Rudd and tell him she's not his anymore. Not by law, not by force, not by anything." The lead man stared long at me, searching for bluff. He found none. Years of war had carved that steadiness into me, and I let him see it plain in my stance. He clicked his tongue, spat to the side, and finally leaned back in his saddle. "She ain't worth dying over." "She ain't dying over you either," I said flat. He gave a sharp tug on his reins, turned his horse, and the other two followed. They didn't ride fast, but they didn't linger either. The dust swallowed them up as they passed over the ridge, leaving the road empty again. Only then did I turn. She was still at the doorframe. Tommy pressed tight to her, her lips parted slightly, not in shock, but in something closer to disbelief. She had braced herself to be handed back, to be told she wasn't worth the trouble. Instead, she'd seen me stand. "Was it him?" I asked, my voice steady. "Vernon Rudd?" She gave a small nod, her eyes wet but unflinching. "I was 12 when they married me off. My uncle arranged it. Said Vernon had land and a roof. What he had was drink and fists." Her words came flat, like stones laid one on top of another. I didn't speak. I let her say what she needed. "I didn't know how to leave," she went on. "Then Tommy came. After that, I couldn't. I was too scared. But when he started hitting Tommy..." Her voice caught, then steadied again. "I packed what I could, left in the night, walked 4 days until I saw your town lights." I looked at the boy then, his small face buried against her skirt, his wooden horse pressed tight to his chest. "He's yours," I said quietly. "You don't need to prove it to anyone." Her shoulders trembled, just a fraction, like something inside her had loosened for the first time in years. She whispered, "I kept thinking when he came, no one would say no to him." "I just did," I said. For a long moment she stood silent, then she guided Tommy back to the cot, her hand never leaving his hair. That night, she didn't retreat to the back room. She curled up with him closer to my desk, closer to where I sat with my rifle across my knees, keeping watch. She didn't ask, I didn't explain. The choice was plain enough. Outside, the wind carried dust across the empty street. Inside, for the first time since she arrived, I felt her believe she wasn't going to be given back, and I swore to myself, sitting there in that flickering lamplight, that no man, Vernon Rudd or anyone else, was going to change that while I still had breath. After the riders left, the street stayed empty, but the air in town felt different, like the dust itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Folks went back to their business behind their shutters, but I knew the story would spread by morning. 3 men had come for her, and I hadn't given her up. That was fine. I'd long stopped caring about whispers. What mattered was the woman standing in my doorway with her boy pressed against her legs, her eyes locked on me, as if she couldn't decide whether to believe what she'd just seen. That night, when Tommy was curled up asleep with the wooden horse tucked under his arm, she stayed by the fire instead of retreating to the back room. The lamplight flickered against her face, showing every line of exhaustion carved into her skin, and for the first time since she arrived, she looked like she wanted to speak. I sat across from her, rifle balanced against my knees, and waited. I've learned silence can open more doors than questions ever will. She took a breath that shuddered in her chest. "I was 12 when they married me off," she said, her voice steady but flat, like a woman reading from a ledger of debts. "My uncle arranged it, said Vernon had land, a house, a future. What he had was whiskey and fists. Her hands twisted in her lap as she spoke, but she never looked away from the flame. I didn't move, didn't interrupt. He didn't want a wife, not really. He wanted someone to own. He told me that more than once whenever I tried to stand up for myself. She drew a sharp breath through her nose, then let it out slow. For years I told myself I could live with it. Then Tommy came and I thought maybe he'd change, but it only got worse. He hit me. Then he started hitting him. Her voice cracked at that, though she forced it back down quick, swallowing the sound. The fire popped, filling the space she left behind. I felt something cold and hot at once burn in my chest. I'd seen men like Rudd before, men who thought a wife was a possession, a child, a thing to shape with fear. They'd strutted through camps during the war, puffed up and loud, but they'd always been the quickest to crumble when steel met bone. I wanted to tell her that, wanted to promise her Rudd was just another coward who'd finally been told no, but I let her keep speaking. I packed what I could, she whispered. Clothes, a little bread, nothing else. I left in the night, walked 4 days before I saw your town lights. She rubbed her arms like the memory still clung to her skin. I thought maybe if I made it far enough he'd stop looking, but he never stopped. He'll keep sending men until he believes I'm dead, or until... Her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees. You're not going back, I said, quiet but sure. Her eyes flicked to mine for the first time that night, sharp and searching. What if he comes again? Then we'll meet him again, I said. She studied me a long moment. Her fingers trembled, but her gaze held steady. I kept thinking, when he found me, no one would stand in his way. That's how it's always been. I let her words hang in the air. Then I said, not anymore. Her lips parted, but no sound came. I could see it in her face, the way disbelief and hope fought each other, neither winning. She'd lived too long in a world where men decided her worth, where her body was a bargain, where silence was survival. To hear someone say no, to see someone stand between her and the fists she'd fled, it wasn't just new, it was almost unbearable. She lowered her eyes, her hands curling together tight. Why? She asked. Not angry, not pleading, just a plain question. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the fire. Because I've seen enough men like him get their way, and I'm done watching it happen. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of things neither of us had words for yet. She sat a little straighter, as though some invisible rope binding her had loosened just a bit. I noticed her shoulders weren't drawn so tight anymore. For the first time, she didn't look like she was ready to bolt at the crack of a door hinge. Tommy stirred then, mumbling in his sleep, and she rose to settle him, smoothing his hair, tucking the blanket closer around his chin. She lingered there a moment, her hand resting on his chest. Then she turned back toward me. I saw something shift in her eyes, something small but real. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the first step toward it. That night, she didn't go back to the small cot in the rear. She pulled a blanket down by the stove and lay with the boy there, closer to where I sat with my rifle across my knees. She didn't ask permission, didn't explain, and I didn't need her to. We both knew what it meant. She wanted him closer to where the danger would be met. I stayed awake long after her breathing had evened out, watching the fire sink into embers, listening to the quiet of the town outside. I knew Rudd wasn't done. Men like him never quit until someone forces their hand. But I also knew this. Whatever came riding down that road again, it wouldn't find her alone. She'd carried too much fear on her own shoulders already. Now, for the first time in her life, she had someone willing to carry part of it for her. And as I sat there, the night deepening around us, I realized something else I hadn't let myself admit in years. Protecting her and that boy didn't feel like duty. It felt like purpose, and that was something I hadn't had since the war ended and the world went quiet. The morning Vernon Rudd rode into Willow Run, I felt it before I saw it. The air had that kind of edge to it, the kind that makes horses restless and sets dogs to pacing. I'd been on the porch since sunup, coffee cooling in my hand, my eyes on the road without even meaning to. Sometimes you know trouble's on its way because silence lays itself down too heavy. And sure enough, The sound of hooves rolled in steady from the ridge, not fast like a rider passing through, but slow, heavy, deliberate. Men who want to be seen always ride that way. He came with 3 others, but it wasn't hard to pick him out. Even from a distance, you could see the meanness sitting in his posture. Rudd sat hunched on his horse like a sack of grain, face swollen red from drink, eyes sharp with something that wasn't courage, just spite. His coat hung filthy, his boots cracked, but he looked at this town like it already belonged to him. The men with him weren't kin, just hired hands. One with a shotgun slung across his back, another carrying a length of chain like he meant to make a show of it, and the third, too young to understand the weight of what he'd signed on for. They followed because coin buys loyalty when nothing else can. I didn't move when they reached the edge of town. I just set my cup down on the step and stood, letting the badge catch the morning light, my hand resting easy near my Colt but not on it. Inside, I knew Layla had already pulled Tommy close, standing by the back wall with her body wrapped around him like a shield. I didn't need to look. I could feel the tension behind me, the way fear sits in a room, even when the door is closed. Rudd swung down from his horse with a grunt, boots thudding against the packed earth. He pointed a finger at me, his voice rough and mean. "You've been holding what's mine." I kept my stance steady, my voice even. "She's not yours. Not now. Not ever again." His face twisted. "She ran from me. Still my wife. That boy's mine too. Makes her a criminal and you a thief." I shook my head. "That boy isn't yours. Not by blood, not by law. And you know it." The men behind him shifted. The one with the shotgun touched the strap across his shoulder, eyes narrowing. The one with the chain grinned like he was itching for a fight. I didn't flinch. The trick with men like that is showing them you've already measured what it would cost to pull that trigger, and you're willing to pay it. "You lay a hand on her again," I said, low and flat, "and you won't leave this town upright." Rudd stepped closer, his breath carrying whiskey sharp enough to sting. "I don't care who you think you are, Sheriff. That woman's mine, always has been, always will be." "She's free," I said, letting the word hang heavy between us. "And she stays free." The young one went for his gun first, his hand shaking just enough to tell me he'd never killed a man before. Mine was out before his cleared leather. One shot, center of his chest. He dropped into the dust, and the echo cracked off the buildings like thunder. The other 2 froze. I already had my barrel turned, steady and unshaking. "You want to follow him?" I asked. My voice never rose, never cracked. I didn't need to shout. The one with the chain muttered a curse, looked at Rudd, then turned back toward his horse. The shotgun man followed, slow but sure, swinging up into the saddle without meeting my eyes. They weren't loyal enough to die for him. I watched them ride out, their dust curling in the morning air, and when the street quieted, it was just me and Rudd left standing in it. He sneered, spit into the dirt. "She'll ruin you. You don't even know what she is." I holstered my Colt, met his stare. "I know exactly what she is. She's free, and you can't touch her again." For the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear exactly, but the sting of being told no in a way he couldn't bend. He shifted on his feet, looked down at the body cooling in the dust, then back up at me. "This ain't over," he muttered. "It is," I said. He climbed back onto his horse, fumbling with the reins, his hands shaking more than he wanted me to see. He didn't look back as he rode out, not even when the ridge swallowed him up. He left the body where it lay, proof enough of what happens when cruelty meets a line it can't cross. Only then did I turn toward the office. She was standing in the doorway, Tommy still tucked against her, her face pale but steady. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded, but her eyes told the truth. She'd expected me to back down, to weigh her worth against the trouble, and decide she wasn't worth it. Instead, I'd stood, and the disbelief in her gaze cut deeper than any bullet ever could. "I didn't expect him to leave," she whispered. "He's not used to someone saying no," I said, "but he's heard it now." She sank onto the bench with Tommy on her lap, her hands smoothing his hair, even though he'd already fallen asleep against her. I poured her a glass of water, set it in her shaking hands, and sat beside her. "He won't come back," I told her. "He knows now he's not welcome." She looked at me, her eyes wet but fierce. "What now?" "Now," I said, "we keep going. Same as before. Only difference is you know he can't take you." Her breath left her slow, like a weight she'd carried too long had loosened. For the first time since she walked into my town, I saw a glimpse of what she might look like unafraid. And I knew, as sure as I knew the weight of the colt on my hip, that I'd stand as many times as it took to keep that look from being stolen again. I never thought life would circle back like this. Years ago, I figured my road had ended in dust and silence, nothing but the creak of my saddle and the hollow beat of my own heart to keep me company. But standing here now, with the cabin lit soft in the twilight and the sound of voices carrying across the yard, I know different. I know the end of one story is just the quiet beginning of another, if only a man learns to listen. When those women first stepped into my life, I didn't see them as a gift. I saw burden, danger, something that might stir up the ache I'd buried under years of solitude. But what a fool I was. They weren't a burden. They were the very thing my soul had been starving for. Each of them carried pieces of themselves that the world had tried to strip away. And somewhere in that fight, in the way they stood together, even while trembling, I saw something that reminded me of the man I'd been before life cut me down. There were nights I lay awake, listening to the wind groan through the pines, thinking about the weight of it all. How could I protect them? How could I keep them safe when I could barely hold my own life steady? But every morning, when I saw them rise with the dawn, faces still tired, yet hands already reaching for work, I realized they didn't need a savior. They just needed someone to stay. And that I could do. Stay. That word was heavier than a rifle in my hands, but it was the kind of weight I wanted to carry. The land itself seemed to shift with us. At first it was a place of survival, scratching food from the dirt, hauling water, keeping watch for shadows moving in the distance. But over time, it softened. The soil gave back more than we asked, the creek ran clearer, and the house felt less like a shell and more like a heart beating steady. Funny how a place changes when people inside it choose each other without condition. I remember one evening clear as day. The sun had just slipped behind the mesa, painting the sky a wild kind of fire. The 5 of them were sitting by the barn, braiding one another's hair, laughing in a way that didn't sound guarded anymore. I leaned against the fence, arms crossed, and for the first time in years I smiled without having to force it. One of them looked up at me, her eyes bright, and she said, "You can sit too, Mason." You don't always have to stand guard. It hit me harder than a bullet. Because she was right. Guarding had been my way of living, but it wasn't living at all. Sitting with them, just being a man among people who trusted me, that was the truest kind of strength. I've learned more in these months than in all my years wandering. I learned that silence doesn't mean emptiness, that grief doesn't mean you stop deserving warmth, that when folks share pain, they also share the power to heal it. And I learned that love, real love, doesn't ask for ownership, only presence. Just showing up day after day, saying without words, "I'm here and I'm not leaving." If you're listening now, maybe you're carrying your own kind of emptiness. Maybe life's taken something from you and left you convinced there's nothing left worth holding on to. But hear me when I say this. Sometimes what saves us isn't thunder or revelation. It's the quiet choice to open the door, to let others sit at the fire, to keep walking even when your knees shake. That's where redemption waits, not in grand victories, but in the slow, steady turning toward one another. Looking at them now, these women who became family without a word of ceremony, I see the truth plain. We weren't meant to walk this earth alone. We're stitched together by choice, by care, by the way we reach out even when it costs us. That's the only kind of legacy worth leaving behind. So this is where my story settles for now, at least the part I can share. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles, its own weather, its own tests. But tonight, the lamps glow warm, supper waits on the table, and laughter rolls through the walls of a house I never thought would feel alive again. That's enough, more than enough. And to you listening, if this story found you in some empty stretch of road, I hope it gave you something to hold. If it did, I'd ask you kindly, like the video, Leave a comment with your thoughts and follow the channel so you can walk with us a little farther down the trail. Stories like these aren't just for telling, they're for carrying together. I'll leave you with this. A man doesn't measure his life by how far he rode or how long he stood alone. He measures it by who sits beside his fire when the night grows cold. And friends, my fire is no longer empty.